The young and the restless spoilers. Phyllis's world had become a labyrinth of terror and confusion, a maze with no visible exit, each turn leading her deeper into a nightmare she never imagined. In the dim light of the isolated room, every creak of the old building and every distant echo intensified her spiraling dread. For so long, she had felt that things were slipping from her grasp, but tonight, the threads of control had completely unraveled. As she sat against the cold, unyielding wall, her mind raced through the puzzle of events that had led her here. The revelation hit her like a bolt of lightning. Michael, the man she had once trusted, was behind her kidnapping. But what twisted motive could have driven him to do something so monstrous? With a sinking feeling, Phyllis recalled the familiar, yet unnerving phrase he had once muttered in a hushed tone, "I'm only following orders." The name Victor echoed in her thoughts, a name synonymous with power, manipulation, and secrets too dark to confront directly. Michael was not acting out of malice on his own accord, he was a mere pawn, executing orders from Victor, whose reputation for controlling the fates of those around him was legendary. Michael's internal turmoil was palpable. The mere mention of his name sent shivers down his spine. How could Phyllis have deduced his involvement? Every time he heard his own name called out in the tense silence, his fear compounded, as if a specter were haunting him. He had never imagined that the seemingly cold, calculated Phyllis could be so perceptive, so intelligent as to connect the dots between his actions and Victor's manipulations. Now, trapped in this claustrophobic scenario, his terror wasn't just for his own safety, it was for the potential fallout from a force as formidable as Victor. The room was filled with a dangerous cocktail of emotions, Phyllis's seething anger, Michael's paralyzing fear, and an overwhelming sense of impending doom. In a sudden burst of fury, Phyllis rose to her feet, her eyes blazing with determination and despair. In her hand, she clutched a sturdy chair, the makeshift weapon symbolizing her desperate desire to break free from this macabre situation. She advanced toward the heavy, stubborn door that separated her from an uncertain fate. The urge to shatter it, to scream out her defiance so that everyone would hear, was overwhelming. Every fiber of her being cried out to shatter the barrier that confined her. But fate, as always, had its own plans. Just as Phyllis was about to bring the chair crashing into the door, a calm yet authoritative voice cut through the chaos. Sharon, her eyes wide with urgent concern, stepped in front of her. "Phyllis, stop," Sharon pleaded, her voice trembling yet resolute. In that split second, a shadow moved at the periphery of their vision, a mysterious figure whose presence sent an icy chill through the room. The stranger's tone was as enigmatic as it was frightening. "If you break that window, Phyllis, you will die instantly." The declaration hung in the air, heavy and ominous. For a fleeting moment, the room fell into a dreadful silence. Phyllis's mind reeled at the words. It was absurd, yet the logic was undeniable. This wasn't the work of a heartless kidnapper, but rather a meticulously calculated plan by someone who intended to keep her alive, at least, in the sense that she would never face an untimely death by her own hand. In her heart, Phyllis knew that the kidnapper's twisted sense of control would never allow such reckless risk. Michael, for all his own terror, was just as caught in the grip of this fate. While Phyllis wrestled with her inner demons and the desperate urge to break free, Michael's fear escalated into full-blown panic. He was not only terrified of what Victor might do next, but also of the ever-looming specter of law enforcement. Every creak of the floor and every distant sound became a reminder of the ticking clock. He could not shake off the overwhelming dread that the police would soon descend upon him. The realization that his every move was under surveillance by forces beyond his control gnawed at him. There was no escape from the consequences of his actions, no matter how meticulously he had tried to cover his tracks. Outside the immediate confines of the room, time was slipping away, and the stakes grew ever higher. Nick and Daniel, two trusted allies who had been working feverishly to piece together the mystery, issued a grim warning that underscored the peril of the situation. "We don't have much time," Nick's voice had quavered over the phone earlier that day. "If we don't find Phyllis and Sharon within 3 days, it's highly likely they're gone. Dead, if not worse." Daniel's words had carried the same desperate urgency, a stark reminder that every passing moment brought them closer to irreversible tragedy. Within this oppressive triangle of fear, betrayal, and uncertainty, every character was now locked into a high-stakes game. Phyllis, the once proud and indomitable woman, now found herself grappling with the limits of her own resilience and the maddening realization that her fate was intertwined with dark forces far beyond her control. Michael's internal conflict, torn between loyalty to a tyrannical mastermind and his own moral compass, became a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. And behind it all loomed Victor, the enigmatic puppeteer whose shadow stretched long and merciless, reminding everyone that in his world, every act of defiance was met with brutal consequences. The air was thick with tension as Phyllis's eyes darted between the door and the ominous stranger. Each heartbeat seemed to echo the warning, a morbid metronome counting down the seconds to an uncertain fate. With every passing moment, the weight of the imminent threat grew heavier, pressing down on her like a vice. She could almost feel the icy grip of destiny, a cold hand tightening around her throat, forcing her to confront the stark reality. Freedom might be just a shattered pane away, but the cost of that freedom could be her very life. Yet, in that moment of paralysis, something within Phyllis stirred, a spark of defiance that refused to be snuffed out. Despite the fear and the suffocating pressure of her predicament, she resolved that she would not be a silent victim of this orchestrated nightmare. With a steely determination born of desperation and the fierce will to survive, she made a silent vow. No matter what dark forces conspired against her, she would fight back, and she would not let her story end in silence or despair. Michael, meanwhile, stood rooted in terror, his internal struggle now a cacophony of regret, fear, and reluctant acknowledgement of his own culpability. The warning of imminent arrest and the threat of exposure loomed over him like a relentless storm, each moment intensifying the pressure until it felt as if his very soul was being wrung dry. Every passing second was a reminder of his inevitable downfall if he continued down this dark path. He was trapped in a web of his own making, a web spun by the machinations of Victor, whose influence stretched into every shadow and every corner of his existence. Outside the room, Nick and Daniel mobilized their limited resources, driven by the grim knowledge that every minute counted. Their investigations, once methodical and measured, had turned into a frantic race against time. The prospect of losing Phyllis and Sharon spurred them into a relentless pursuit, each clue and each lead pursued with the urgency of life or death. Their determination, however, was tempered by the grim realization that in the world they inhabited, the line between life and death was all too thin, a line that could be crossed at the faintest provocation. In the midst of this chaos, every character was forced to confront their deepest fears and the reality that nothing was as it seemed. The binding chains of duty, betrayal, and relentless ambition wove a tapestry of intrigue that left no one unscathed. Phyllis's anger at her captor, Michael's terror of the looming consequences, and the desperate resolve of Nick and Daniel all coalesced into a moment of profound reckoning. In this crucible of emotions and high stakes, the true cost of power, loyalty, and defiance was laid bare. As the final hours of the fateful day crept closer, the question hung in the air like a guillotine's blade: would Phyllis's burning desire for freedom overcome the paralyzing grip of fear and oppression? Or would the dark, inexorable forces that governed their lives prove too mighty, consigning her to a fate worse than death, a life shackled by despair, manipulation, and the relentless pursuit of a freedom that could never be truly reclaimed? In that charged silence, with hearts pounding and destinies entwined, every soul present braced for the inevitable storm. The fragile hope of survival clashed with the overwhelming power of those who manipulated it, and in that crucible, the seeds of a new, unforeseen rebellion began to take root, a rebellion that would challenge not just the tyrants of the present, but the very fabric of the treacherous world they had created. Thus, in the dim corridor of that fateful night, where every shattered fragment of glass and every whispered threat spoke of impending doom, a battle for control, identity, and life itself had begun. The struggle was no longer merely about survival, it was about reclaiming the shattered pieces of one's soul and daring to rewrite a destiny that had been so cruelly dictated by others. And in that moment, as hope flickered like a fragile candle against the encroaching darkness, the promise of change became as palpable as the fear that had brought them all together. In the tangled web of deceit and power that had long defined their lives, Michael and Victor now found themselves in a situation that chilled them to the core. The carefully constructed facade that had kept their identities hidden was crumbling. Every whispered conversation and subtle gesture now carried the heavy burden of exposure. The stakes had never been higher. Michael, with eyes wide in palpable terror, was haunted by the knowledge that his voice, once a familiar, unremarkable tone, had betrayed him. Phyllis, with her razor-sharp intellect, had caught on to the unmistakable nuances of his speech. It wasn't simply what he said, it was the cadence, the subtle emphasis on certain words, the nervous stutter that had marked his every command. To Phyllis, every syllable was a clue, a piece of the puzzle that led directly to him. In her mind, the revelation was as clear as day: if she managed to escape, she would wield undeniable evidence against them, a damning blow that would send Michael and, more importantly, Victor straight to prison. Victor, ever the puppeteer, was equally tormented. For years, his influence had been absolute, a force that steered the fates of everyone around him with cold precision. But now, with his identity and operations in peril of exposure, he felt the icy grip of vulnerability. Every plan, every secret meeting, every meticulously orchestrated scheme was under threat. His reputation, built on decades of manipulation and ruthlessness, now teetered on the edge of collapse. Michael's panicked glances and the unmistakable tremor in his voice were a constant reminder that his carefully laid plans were unraveling. In another part of this labyrinthine saga, hope emerged in the form of a determined trio: Nick, Daniel, and Chance. While the dark forces of Victor and Michael worked to consolidate their crumbling power, Nick and Daniel had joined forces with Chance, whose instincts and investigative acumen had become indispensable. The trio had thrown themselves into a frantic search for evidence, combing through every shadowed corner and forgotten space of Genoa. Their mission was clear and fraught with urgency: uncover the hidden truths that could dismantle the towering empire of deception and bring justice to those wronged. Chance, in particular, had become the beacon of hope in their struggle. Through relentless investigation and an uncanny knack for finding clues in the most unlikely places, Chance had gathered a collection of crucial evidence. Each fragment of proof was a piece of the puzzle, a lead that, if connected properly, could blow open the entire case against Victor and his cohorts. His discovery hinted at a larger conspiracy, one that stretched far beyond the confines of a single location or a single criminal mind. With the evidence in hand, Chance decided that it was time to take decisive action. He called upon Nick and Daniel, and together, the three set out on a covert operation that would take them deep into the heart of Genoa. Their destination was an abandoned hospital, a relic of a bygone era, now cloaked in eerie silence and neglect. The hospital had long been rumored to harbor secrets, hidden away in its decaying corridors and dust-laden rooms. For Chance, it represented the nexus of a critical breakthrough. The journey to the hospital was shrouded in tension. Every step was taken with extreme caution, as the trio knew that discovery would spell disaster. The abandoned building loomed before them like a spectral giant, its windows staring blankly out like unseeing eyes. Shadows danced along the walls, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the vast, empty halls, a constant reminder of the relentless passage of time and the decay of forgotten memories. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation and dread. Nick, Daniel, and Chance moved silently through the corridors, their flashlights barely piercing the darkness. Every creak of the old floorboards, every whisper of wind through shattered windows, was a reminder of the fragility of their mission. They had no room for error. The evidence that Chance had unearthed was their lifeline, a chance to piece together the narrative that would expose the dark underbelly of Victor's empire. In a secluded room at the far end of the hospital, hidden behind layers of rusted metal and broken glass, they discovered what they had been searching for. Piled up in a disorganized heap were documents, photographs, and encrypted digital files. Each item was a thread in a tapestry of deception, a piece of the puzzle that, when assembled, painted a vivid picture of corruption and betrayal. The discovery was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was exhilarating because it provided the first tangible link between the shadowy figures at the top and the series of crimes that had left so many lives shattered. It was terrifying because they realized that this was only the tip of the iceberg, a single piece of evidence in a much larger, more dangerous game. Chance carefully sifted through the documents, his mind racing as he tried to decode the implications of each piece of information. The files revealed secret meetings, covert transactions, and unspoken agreements that spanned decades. It became clear that the abandoned hospital was more than just a hideout. It was a secret repository of Victor's darkest operations, a place where incriminating evidence had been hidden away, perhaps as a safeguard against the very chaos now unfolding. Outside, the tension was reaching a fever pitch. Michael's fear was now palpable in every hushed word and every nervous glance. He knew that every moment counted. The threat of exposure was no longer a distant possibility but an imminent reality. His internal conflict, torn between following orders and the creeping realization of his own culpability, was a battle he could no longer control. The shadow of impending arrest loomed over him like a relentless storm cloud, darkening even the smallest moments of respite. Victor, too, was frantically orchestrating countermeasures. He moved like a master strategist, issuing orders and rallying his loyalists to safeguard their crumbling empire. But even as he scrambled to cover his tracks, the evidence was closing in. Every piece of proof gathered by Chance, every lead uncovered by Nick and Daniel, was a nail in the coffin of his carefully curated image. The walls were closing in, and there was no longer a safe haven for those who had thrived on subterfuge. As Nick, Daniel, and Chance meticulously documented every detail within the abandoned hospital, a cold determination settled over them. They understood that what they had discovered was far more than just evidence, it was the catalyst for a revolution against tyranny and corruption. Their mission was now more critical than ever, a race against time where failure was not an option. They moved silently, like ghosts in a haunted corridor, every sense alert to the possibility of betrayal or sudden attack. Back at the stronghold of Victor's operations, anxiety reigned supreme. Michael's internal strife had reached a boiling point, and Victor's meticulously orchestrated empire was on the verge of collapse. The pressure was immense, and every decision was a step closer to either salvation or utter ruin. The forces of justice and retribution were gathering, and the thin veneer of control that had long defined their lives was beginning to crack. In the dim glow of the hospital's decaying lights, the trio's discovery was a beacon of hope, a tangible weapon against the tide of darkness that had engulfed their lives. Each document, each photograph, was a story waiting to be told, a testimony to the corruption that had long plagued the corridors of power. For Nick, Daniel, and Chance, the abandoned hospital was more than just a relic of the past. It was a battleground where the future of justice would be decided. The mission was far from over. With the evidence secured, they faced the daunting task of unraveling the complex network of deceit and betrayal that had ensnared their city. Every secret uncovered was a step closer to exposing the true face of the enemy, a face that lurked behind layers of lies and manipulation, determined to keep its secrets buried. The journey ahead was fraught with danger, but for those who had suffered under Victor's reign, it was a path toward redemption and retribution. In this high-stakes game of cat and mouse, every heartbeat echoed with the promise of justice, every shadow whispered of a past that demanded reckoning. Michael and Victor's days were numbered, and as the forces of truth and courage gathered strength, the oppressive weight of their hidden crimes began to crumble. The battle for control, identity, and ultimately, freedom was about to enter its most critical phase, a phase where every decision could tip the scales between redemption and downfall. Thus, in the silent corridors of an abandoned hospital, amidst the echoes of forgotten memories and the relentless ticking of a clock that waited for no one, the seeds of a new revolution were sown. It was a revolution not born of anger or vengeance, but of a steadfast commitment to unmasking the truth. And as Nick, Daniel, and Chance prepared to take the next step, they knew that the coming days would be a relentless pursuit, a race against time to ensure that the voices of the oppressed would not be silenced by the very hands that had betrayed them. In the heart of Genoa, where every secret had its price and every hidden truth threatened to ignite a conflagration, the quest for justice had taken on a new urgency. The fate of many now rested on the shoulders of those brave enough to defy the shadows. And as the final pieces of the puzzle slowly fell into place, it became clear that the struggle was not just for survival, it was for the very soul of a city gripped by the relentless hand of corruption.